and implied, and even their missionaries implied, that theirs was the best, and they were inferior human beings, and their religion was holding them back. And that's what the sort of thing that makes people say, wait a minute, you know, these are our sacred values. But when you're in that defensive mode, instead of reaching out, exploring, but trying to preserve, then I think that's when you can become, when new barriers are erected. And I think a lot of the Muslim world experienced a huge drop in status. From being a great world power, it became overnight into a subjugated state. And modernity has progressed very, very rapidly in these countries. In Europe and later the United States, we had 300 years to develop our secular institutions and the new economy and the new ideas. This didn't happen in the Muslim world. They had to do it yesterday. So, and as a result, all kinds of problems came into a society where a small westernized elite would be trying to adjust Islam to modernity in some way. And one of the things that Islam became was less Sufi-oriented and more anxious to show that Islam was really just as rational as the Enlightenment, and trying to ape the West. Part of the problem with the Muslim world, with modernity, has been the fact that modernity has two characteristics. And if you don't have these characteristics, these qualities, no matter how many computers or fighter jets you have, there's something wrong. One is independence, because however traumatic our modernization was in Europe, it was punctuated by declarations of independence on all fronts. Inventors and scientists declaring their freedom of thought. They must have freedom of thought to be able to invent without intervention from the religious establishment. Martin Luther declared independence of the Roman Catholic Church. The Declaration of Independence in the United States was a typical modernizing document. And the other thing was innovation, because we were always doing something new, inventing something fresh, proceeding according to the dynamic of our own society, not according to somebody else's. Now, what happened in the Muslim world is that the new modern economy came not with independence, but with dependence, with colonial subjugation. And it came not with innovation, but imitation, because we were so far ahead. And imitation is never the same thing. So the wrong ingredients have been going in. And it's like making a cake. If you have a nice recipe, but you don't have flour, you only have, say, powdered rice, and you don't have real eggs, and you don't have the correct oven, you're not going to get that floury cake in the cookbook. You're going to could get something very unpleasant indeed. And so those wrong ingredients have been going in, and that's skewed the whole effort in a way. All this has increased Muslim defensiveness. It doesn't help, too, that the West has long had a derisive, dismissive view of Islam. It goes right back to the Middle Ages, to the time of the Crusades. And in the colonial period, this became combined with a sort of contempt and saying that Islam is a fatalistic state and, subjugates women, as though the Christian world had never subjugated women itself. So this kind of dismissive attitude that was there in colonial times, it's certainly in the Western press now and in people's speech about Islam, this also makes Muslims feel insecure and aggressive and determined to uphold the tradition in its purity at all costs. I would say that most of these, some would call them fundamentalist movements or traditionalist movements, are very much asserting particularism. It's certainly true in the United States. American fundamentalism, I can call it that because that's what they call themselves, it's a form of religious nationalism. They want a different kind of America, a Christian America, not a secular America. They are constantly striving to make America more Christian in their terms. And they're fiercely patriotic. Any other culture doesn't bear any, because it's not Christian, as it were. And certainly Jewish fundamentalism is deeply bound up with the State of Israel. Every single fundamentalist movement in Judaism is either extremely passionately for the State of Israel or else passionately against it. Some groups see it as an abomination. So that political thing is right at the heart of a lot of these new Jewish movements. Similarly, in Islam, I think the welfare of the Ummah, the Muslim community, has always been crucial to Muslim piety and Muslim faith. The well-being of the Ummah is a reflection of the state of Islam in people's mind and heart. The Quran calls upon us to develop a just and equal society where all people are treated with respect. And so when Muslims see their Ummah under corrupt or dictatorial rulers, rabidly secular rulers, cruel rulers, or when they see it humiliated by foreign powers, they can feel as concerned as Christians do when they see the Bible trampled upon. Now, when you come to terrorism or extremism, real extremism, that's another matter, because most of these groups, the Christian fundamentalists say, or some of the Jewish groups in Israel, do not take part in acts of terror and violence. Most are simply trying to live what they regard as a good religious life in a world that seems increasingly hostile to their religion. And the extremism is an actual terror atrocity. This is the preserve only of a very, very small handful of people. And it is very politically motivated, I think. And I think it shows despair of the current normative political processes. And when people lose hope, they often feel they have nothing to lose. But I'm about to make a big study of the violence and religion, looking at the whole thing not just from the point of view of Islam or monotheisms, but right across the board, and see how very much it's tied up with this construction of the state and the economy. It always has been, right from the word go, that violence and religion get sucked up in it. And we have to remember too that our modernity, for all its achievements, has been spectacularly violent, because we have created the technology that's been able to kill more people more efficiently than ever before on an absolutely horrendous scale. And our whole ethos is aggressive, the way we speak to one another, the way we relate to other nations, the way we conduct daily business in the marketplace. And it's not surprising that religion has absorbed in some of its manifestations some of that modern violence. My first encounter with Sufism was a revelation to me, and changed not only my view of Islam, but changed my view of religion in general. And so I think there it has a real role to play, because one of the things, it was also an authentic form of Islam in many, many regions of the Muslim world until the coming of modernity, until about the 19th century, when, in order to prove its parity with the West, Muslims started to declare their religion was rational and pushed Sufism to one side. Now, one has to be careful to say that Sufism, any form of mysticism, requires great discipline. It requires learning, discipline, hard work, talent. I would love to be a mystic, but I am not a mystic. I don't have that talent. But that would have been true of the wide diversity of Muslims before the modern period who took part in Sufi rituals without being a major mystic ascending, like Rumi, for example. You can participate at different levels. And one of those levels, I think, is this outstanding appreciation of other faiths and other traditions. The humility whereby we realize that once we glimpse the divine, these distinctions fall apart. The Sufism of love, of gentleness too, could be crucial as a counterbalance to the rather hardness of some religious discourse, not only in Islam, but in the world generally. Discourse, as I say, is aggressive. It's aggressive in religion. Certainly there are forms of Christianity that are very, very harsh on wrongdoers and people they feel are not living up to the Christian ideal, or other faiths. And I often wonder whether they've read the Gospels, because Jesus seemed to go out of his way to go and be with people who were scorned by the establishment. He would sit down and have dinner with all the wrong people and say that everybody of goodwill was welcome in the kingdom of God, and rich and poor could sit together. So sometimes we forget, in our zeal to protect, we forget that kind of outreach, and I think you have that in Sufism. The Sufi impulse, the conversion to Sufism, often came with the perception that there's something wrong with society. It was a call not just to a private mysticism, but to a sense of justice and a desire to improve the lot of their fellow human beings. And many of the Muslim reformers, you know, I am thinking of Muhammad Abdu and Iqbal, were very influenced by Sufism. And it's very creative too, that type of mysticism, that type of spirituality. And creativity is what we need now, not just sticking to tradition, which can make us hidebound. A lot of people say too, it's a pity Islam didn't have a reformation. Now, from the perspective of a Christian and a European, the Reformation was in many ways an absolute disaster for Europe. It resulted in the killing of many people and split Europe. It helped to split Europe and divide it into the warring camps that have continued. It was very bound up with early nationalism, and that's never a good idea. And similarly, the Enlightenment was a response to that horror. And it had its points, but ultimately that project of getting rid of bigotry spectacularly failed, because, as we saw at the time of the Nazi horror. So it's great arrogance to say that everybody has to pass through the same process as Europeans or the West. The West were very much newcomers onto the cultural scene from a point of view of the older cultures. And I think that some Western countries, and certainly this is particularly true of the United States, where this view is always being put forward, is that they have been in a predominant state for so long, they don't know the main flux of human history, which is that we all take 2 steps forward and then fall back. They're convinced with the ideal of progress, and that they have got this progress, and they started at point X and now are going onwards and upwards forever. But in fact, this is not the case with human affairs. Human affairs proceed much more jerkily and and according to different dynamics in different cultures. The modern world is here to stay until it collapses, until its economy finally collapses, and then God help us. But until that time, people will come to this in their own way, drawing on their own resources, engaging with their own problems, and bringing their own insights to it. And this sort of arrogant thing that everyone's got to go through an enlightenment is just absurd. And in many ways, Muslims went through an enlightenment very similar in the 8th and 9th centuries under the Abbasid caliphs. You had your great philosophers, you had your encounter with the Greek Western world then, and very creative it was, and you advanced science and were able to Islamize it and make something rich of it. No, I think this view is limited and patronizing. It's also clear, too, that certain economies, certain way in which people come to modernity affects the modernity that actually emerges in each state. And to foist an enlightenment and say everyone's got to have one, this is the model, is simply absurd. I think these remarks that Islam needs a reformation shows A, an ignorance of Muslim history, because there's been constant reform movements right the way from the very beginning of Islam. Reform simply means that you look at what's going on around you and you say, now, how does my tradition speak to these particular circumstances? So this kind of remark that everybody's got to have a reformation shows ignorance of Muslim history, but also ignorance of the European history and the awful effects of the Reformation. You know, people always saying they need a Martin Luther. I think the last thing you need is a Martin Luther. Luther was a difficult, utterly depressed human being. I mean, suffering massive depression. He'd almost be probably, I don't know, clinically depressed today. And called it tristitia that would descend upon him. But this tristitia, this made him angry. He was such an angry man. And we've got enough angry men in the world as it is. Transcendence is impossible to define by its very nature. It's impossible to define transcendence, but it simply means, to climb above or to climb across, to go from what we see, what we know with our senses, and most of our knowledge, our mundane knowledge, is based from sense data and from what we can deduce from that rationally. But we also have other forms of experience that transcend that. That is what human beings are. We have ideas and concepts and experiences that go beyond what we can grasp conceptually. We've always done it. It's a peculiar characteristic of the human mind. In fact, human beings can be called Homo religiosus as well as Homo sapiens, because we are unique, I think, among the species in needing to relate, trying, working